Hey all, here are OS Reviews. Today we're taking a throwback look at the Asus Zenfone Zoom. This was a unique camera-centric smartphone released at the end of 2015, making it now approaching 8 years old. But what makes it really interesting is that camera, not because it's necessarily the best quality, but rather it has a continuous 3 times optical zoom, which is a feature that Sony has been touting in their marketing, calling their new Xperia Mark IV, quote-unquote, the world's first smartphone with a true optical zoom lens, which is just not really correct. True continuous optical zoom differs from the telephoto zoom lens that we typically have on modern smartphones, whether on Android or iPhones, in that those will have a preset magnification amount. Zooming in between those magnification times before we hit 2 times or 5 times will all be done digitally, which will be reducing the resolution and quality of the shots versus a true optical zoom lens, which you are preserving the quality while you are zooming smoothly in between those modes. It's also why if you're often recording video and you're using zoom, a lot of times the digital zoom will seem really jumpy compared to a true continuous zoom system. Even earlier devices, including the Nokia N93, which was this crazy transforming camcorder-esque smartphone that ran on Symbian OS and has the camera in the hinge, also offers a true continuous 3 times optical zoom. Not to mention devices like Samsung's Galaxy S4 Zoom or K Zoom, which is why, again, the N93 and the Zenfone Zoom, as well as the newer Sony Xperia Mark IV, are arguably more practical in that they do actually physically move in terms of the lens, but it's all enclosed in a fixed housing, as opposed to extending outwards, and everything is protected by this thin layer of glass. It also makes the phone part still very manageable in terms of thickness. However, one downside, which remains true even in the newest Xperia Mark IV, is that because the housing is so thin, you don't get quite as large of a zoom range. Other areas which made this phone unique included the overall design, a little reminiscent of the LG G4. This is actually made out of a genuine leather backing, but definitely made it feel softer and more comfy to the touch. The back here also featured a single loudspeaker, and aside from that optical zooming lens, there's a dual-tone LED flash, as well as laser autofocus, and the glass that is covering the top here is actually made by HOYA. We make the lenses that many folks are wearing if they have prescription glasses, as opposed to a company like, say, Carl Zeiss, Leica, Schneider. They're all examples of this branding going on to try and make it just feel a little bit more prestigious. The accent here is made out of aluminum metal, and the same thing can be said about the frame of this phone, which is also crafted out of metal and does feel pretty solid and reassuring. At the time, Asus was more well known for making low-cost budget phones, and this was one of their first devices that they tried to make something a little bit more premium. Now, the back cover, even though it's made out of leather, can actually be pulled off. However, the actual battery, which is rated at 3000 milliamp hours, is fixed. Along the bottom of the device, you'll find access to a lanyard strap, a common tray on most point-and-shoot cameras. It was using a micro USB port that was still the norm back in 2015, microphone, and then on the right-hand spine you have access to the 2-stage camera shutter key that you can press on to instantly launch the camera, along with a dedicated key for instantly recording video. Now, this thing could record video up to 1080p, so it's not quite 4K capture, again, just due to the times, but it was still very nice to have this dedicated hardware feature, pretty rare on modern Android phones. The side here also features a power key along with a volume rocker that also dubs as zoom controls, even labeled that way to make it feel more convincing as you're using the optical zoom. Top here, of course, houses a 3.5mm headphone jack. Now, this is a 5.5-inch phone. Even in 2023 standards, it really isn't too small, I'd say. In fact, because of the older 16:9 aspect ratio, we're still talking about a device that feels pretty substantial in the hands. Of course, it's going to be maybe a touch smaller than most 6.8-inch taller aspect ratio flagships that we have today, but it's not too far off. Now, at the bottom of this Full HD resolution display, there were 3 capacitive hotkeys, which were unfortunately not backlit, so it made it a little harder to see in the dark. A 5-megapixel selfie camera was located at the top. This device also came with relatively high-end specs for the time, including 4 gigabytes of RAM, and it was powered by the Intel Atom Z3580 processor at 2.3 gigahertz with PowerVR G6 430 GPU. So the Intel Atom chipset is something that we just don't see anymore in modern smartphones. It was back when Intel was still trying to make a foray into the world of mobile tech. Regardless, it was an interesting moment in history where there was this third player, and in terms of benchmarks, it offers pretty comparable performance to the early Qualcomm Snapdragon 800, 801 chips, so not too bad. Still seems speedy enough to handle most regular usage. Taking a closer look now at the aforementioned UI here first, it is definitely not stock, and it came with quite a heavy amount of bloatware from both Asus and carriers alike, but luckily you could uninstall most of these apps if you didn't really use them, although again Asus gave you basically their versions of all the standard utility tools as well. At least it is a coherent UI experience, including their versions of the clock app, as well as even their versions of calculator apps can be found and just look a little bit different from stock Android, as you can see there, with more colorful accents overall. Maybe not the most elegant UI in the world, but definitely a lot of different features you're able to access. Drag down notification shade, also very similar if you have tried out or seen other Zenfone devices from the past. And on this phone, you can have access to Bluetooth, GPS, NFC, Wi-Fi. It's a 4G LTE device, so pretty typical in terms of all these controls, as well as a one-handed mode can also be triggered. Then dragging down on the main screen will pull up the universal search along with some recently used applications. Luckily, you can also install something as simple as Nova Launcher and just have a much cleaner Android experience akin to modern Android devices. But at the very least, there was still the standard Google Play Store as well as the regular Google apps as well. You can even further customize how the animations flipping between screens look, change the color temperature of the display to make it more accurate, vivid, or based on whatever preferences that you want at the moment. And again, I can just long hold pretty much on the camera shutter key to instantly jump into the shooting mode. Let's go ahead and do that. You'll hear a buzz. You are able to kind of see the lens there start to move around in the background, which is definitely pretty cool. Now, a few final clips here from the design, so you can tell this is really how the lens is working underneath there to pick up the details as it's zooming. It is OIS as well, so there is optical image stabilization that can mitigate some of the shakiness, and also if you're shooting in slightly darker environments. So pretty interesting tech. It is also worth mentioning that this type of continuous optical zoom lens system is making, again, a little bit of a resurgence. There are also sensors being created by now LG as well as Oppo in their research facilities that are trying to make it more mass producible, and so perhaps other Android smartphones in the near future will also adopt a similar type of lens system. It doesn't have to be really in-house. And when it comes to usability, it actually is surprisingly good when it comes to the actual 3x continuous zoom, that is, as you are, say, recording video or transitioning between the different magnification times, and everything can still remain quite sharp. You can also zoom past 3x, as you can see there, but it will give you another haptic buzz to remind you that you're leaving the 3x zoom range, and you're now going to be using the digital zoom getting beyond this point. That will further get you up to 12x zoom. The camera interface is what we can call as a kitchen sink approach. There's just a ton of different modes that you have available to play around with, including an auto HDR mode, but this was still in the very early days of HDR processing. So we have come a long way in computational photography since the days of the original Pixel that came out really just a year or two after this thing. But you can still find a ton of different filters and effects on here, including a manual mode, which is really awesome. There's even a histogram view at the bottom. It does give you a truly pro-grade kind of interface. You can take a look at how much you're tilting the camera. Things like exposure, ISO, autofocus can all be customized to your liking. Even a depth of field effect, aka bokeh, could be accessed here. But because it is a single lens camera, it is capturing also two separate images and then stitching them together to process. So as a result, you can imagine that it will take longer to get the same effect compared to our modern devices, which may have a second lens just for the depth information to be collected. But nonetheless, a lot of these effects at least are fun to play around with, even if not all of them are going to be working as flawlessly as we would expect them to today. Generally speaking, colors in the auto mode also seem good enough, with at least sufficient sufficient details when it comes to clouds and textures and well-lit environments for them to still be usable. Night here starting to creep into the skies, and I think it's capturing the colors actually surprisingly quite well in these particular examples, so not bad. One, of course, con though would be, first of all, there is no xenon flash, so it's still a regular LED flash, a little bit weaker compared to a more pro-grade camera like the Lumia, say 1020. The other one being that the sensor is not the largest. You do have to be in very well-lit environments. If you are using it indoors and the sun is setting, it's going to look a lot more grainy and dark. Here's another pretty dramatic shot capturing a bit of the moon, even though it's still fully lit outside, using that 3x zoom, and this is what it looks like without the 3x zoom. So you get the idea here. The leaves still look to have plenty of detail. Ultimately, by 2023 standards, this is by no means an exceptional camera. Even during its time, it was not one of the best of its class when it came to the actual resolution as well as the color science of that primary lens. But still, that folding, kind of telescopic, true continuous optical zoom part was what made it really unique, and that aspect did function quite well. One more potential benefit of a system like this compared to a multi-camera array, which maybe has a secondary telephoto lens, is there is a difference in quality between those camera lenses inherently, just based on their using different sensors, they have different resolutions, which makes the transition feel a lot more abrupt. That single speaker there at the back is not the best in the world, just because it's a little easy to cover up, but it is what it is. At least you can use your own headphones or opt for Bluetooth headphones instead. Again, a pretty good display, even though bezels are by no means small. They were pretty chunky back in 2015 even, and things like just strolling around, reading the news, thankfully still feels responsive enough. And that is one of the benefits of having a device that was once considered overkill in terms of specs. 4 gigs of RAM was pretty much top of the line back in 2015, and although these days we often want to look for more than just 4 gigs, as a base capacity it still is getting you by in terms of loading back some articles, and that RAM management is also handled surprisingly well. You'll notice some slight slowdowns as you have more and more programs open, but between 5 and 8 it still seems to be doing okay. Simple, more 2D or tap-and-go games such as Stack will still function alright. If you're playing things more graphically demanding like Asphalt or PUBG, they will often just close and give you very choppy experience, as you can see there. But in moderate usage, you can still get you by. So that's more or less it as far as our revisited throwback look at the Asus Zenfone Zoom. Again, a very interesting device, and although this is by no means an exceptional phone in terms of performance, I think it still is a very interesting one that deserves to be remembered. Looking back at these kind of unique, quirky phones in terms of camera systems is always fun to revisit. So you can check out more details if you're interested in the links down below, but for now that's been our video. Thanks for watching here at OS Reviews. That's been a throwback look at the Asus Zenfone Zoom.